Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed and on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 149. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to Siberia on adventure travel, perhaps misadventure travel. Listen in to what might be titled A Trek Too Far, today on the Amateur Traveler.
I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. And before we get into today's interview, we have a few news stories for you. First one is, in sad news, Dave Freeman, the man behind the famous travel guide 100 Things to Do Before You Die, has died after hitting his head in a fall at his home in Venice. And sadly, the writer Freeman did not get a chance to finish all 100 activities that he described in his book. If you were looking for a chance to win a trip, you can potentially put one of your pictures on the cover of a Lonely Planet guide to Istanbul, London, Barcelona, or Paris by joining an online photo sharing site called Picchio that is doing a contest with Lonely Planet. And I don't want to take it too lightly. A airline official has been sentenced to death, and no, it's not United because they've just raised the price of their snacks to $9, but instead an official from China Southern Airlines that was sentenced for embezzlement in China, which carries a death penalty. For links to all those stories, as well as information about this week's airplane crash in Madrid, the FAA delays, the new national park quarters, and some more problems with drunk British tourists in Crete, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. This show is again sponsored by Budget Rental Car. If you want to save $30 off your weekly rental or 10% off any order, go to budget.com/travel. I'd like to welcome to the show Sheila from Chicago, who has come to talk to us about Siberia. Sheila, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's a pleasure being with you.
Siberia. I had some requests from people to do more domestic podcasts. This is sort of the opposite of that. I think of Siberia, I think of the other side of the world. What led you to Siberia?
I'm always looking for someplace unique, different, untraveled to go to, and about, let's see, 6 years ago, a blurb from Mountain Travel So Bad
Okay.
came across my site that they were having a trek in Siberia. And of course I thought, well, all right, even though people usually were there in gulags, I can certainly go to Siberia too.
I assume you didn't go in winter. Let's start with that.
No, we did not go in winter, but I do know people who have gone in winter
Interesting.
and gone to Lake Baikal.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, you can go to Siberia in the winter. I would imagine it's going to be a lot more difficult to get around, but with a good organizer, it's certainly doable.
Let's start with just an overall impression. Could you give us some idea of what your itinerary was for your tour?
It was a trekking tour, and the American person who was going to be the tour leader, we had traveled with before in Kyrgyzstan. He had led a trek there. He
Okay.
is, believe it or not, he's a professor in the state of Washington and worked for the State Department in Russia for many, many years and speaks fluent Russian. Great guy, personable, et cetera, et cetera. So I had no qualms about going with him. I thought, well, if I'm going to go to Siberia, at least I know Rob, and I'm not at all worried. I know I'm in good hands. And then, of course, there would be a Russian tour organizer in charge of all the logistics in Siberia.
Okay. Now, the fact that you've been to Kyrgyzstan says you're already someone who is more of an adventure traveler, that you're more comfortable outside the bounds of the Club Med.
My husband and I started with the Club Meds and laying our bodies on beaches and getting suntan and all that kind of stuff. But as we've grown older, it's just a very, very big world out there. And as long as I'm not going to be canyoning through something extremely dangerous or going to a country where there is an active war going on and bombs going off all around me, it's like, why not? Why not go to these places? What is the worst that's going to happen? You'll hate it. And I've had trips like that where I have hated them, even if they're not that adventurous.
Okay. And how would you describe Siberia? How ready is it for tourism? Is it still adventure travel, or do I just have the wrong perception?
No, you do not have the wrong
Okay.
perception. It is really not ready for tourism. The only people who do go to Siberia are the Russians, and they have it all to themselves, enjoying these gorgeous mountains and vistas and just forests as far as the eye can see and beyond that. And adventure travelers, people who go, well, perhaps we ought to go to Siberia before it really is ready for travelers.
When you say forest as far as the eye can see, my understanding is when you take the Trans-Siberian Railroad, it's forests for day after day after day after day.
It is supposed to be that, and actually, let me just put my 2 cents in on the Trans-Siberian. I don't know if you've taken it, but I do have brutally honest friends who did it, and they said, yes, it is an experience, but it is incredibly boring.
That's what I've heard,
Incredibly
actually.
boring. Being cramped up in these small little compartments, day in and day out, and just watching the forest go by. Much more interesting to actually be out and walking in it than to go, oh, more forest.
And so you flew into where?
We had to fly to Moscow first.
Okay.
And then from Moscow, it's another 4 hours by air to Barnaul,
Sure, okay.
Barnaul. I mean, there's no easy way to get there. And that's going from west to east. A more difficult way would be if you flew from the west coast and then went to Kamchatka or via Alaska and then worked your way through all these towns that I have trouble pronouncing, like Novosibirsk or something like
Okay.
that.
And then you were trekking, so how long was the trek?
The actual trek, I think, was 10 days. And then from Barnaul, it was a 7, 8, 9-hour ride to even get to where the put-in spot was for the trekking.
Okay.
Because this particular area is in the Altai region of Siberia, and you border Mongolia,
Okay.
China, and Russia. The 3 borders almost meet right there.
Interesting. Okay. And what was the highlight for you?
The highlight had to be the Russian people that we met along the route. They were the only people other than our small group of 14. And they were completely surprised to see any Westerners at all, let alone a group of 14 Americans out there enjoying their wide open spaces. That was the major highlight after, of course, these gorgeous snow-capped mountains and space, clean air, clean rivers. It's just incredibly beautiful.
And you said the put-in. Were you on boats?
Actually, no, we were not on boats, and put-in is really the wrong
Okay.
term. Let's use trailhead. The
All right.
trailhead, where we started.
Okay. What was the biggest surprise?
Well, the first surprise at the trailhead, as we head off with our Russian guide and a very, very small crew of only 3 people, got to our first spot and discovered that the Russian guide had left half the tents behind and most of the equipment for eating. So we all huddled together while he sent Slava, the horseman, back to get tents. It's like, oh, well, this is going to be a very, very interesting trip.
When you say not quite ready for tourism, they weren't necessarily as organized as you'd find on most of, I think, the Mountain Sobek trips, from what I've heard.
To put it, that's a minor comment on it. The whole trip was completely disorganized. We spent the whole trip eating standing up because there was nothing to sit on unless you sat in the mud or a rock or something like that. There were not enough metal plates, so we shared plates and silverware. We had a really great group of people. And we weren't talking young people either. I would say that the average age was at least 40 plus. So
Okay.
You're talking about a good group of people who were willing to go with the flow, and we just sat around and laughed as each circumstance came along, including the worst part of the entire trip. Well, actually, there were 2 worst parts of the entire trip.
Don't just leave me hanging.
As I thought, I would leave you hanging. The first one is half of the group were what we called the Jets. They consisted of 7 people, including one woman who runs the Pikes Peak Marathon every single year, runs to the top, then runs back down.
Okay, all right.
All right, so that'll give you some indication of the kind of shape they were in. Now, I consider my husband and myself, we're both in our late 60s now. 6 years ago, I was 62 years old, he was 63. We're in really good shape. We've run marathons many, many years back. We try to do moderate hiking, stay in fairly decent shape. And I consider my husband, who I refer to as the ex-Marine, pretty fast, and I consider myself pretty fast. Well, we were snails compared to the Jets. The Jets would take off every morning, walking, hiking, and you wouldn't see them again for hours until the guide would force a halt. Well, this particular day, they divided the group into 2, us little slowpoke snails in one group and the Jets in another. And the guide, Leonid, said, oh, don't worry, you just go right up this mountain. Slava, with his horse, will be waiting for you at the top, and he will escort you to camp. So Steve and I set off, got to the top of the mountain before the rest of our 7 people, and found the trail and decided no Slava in sight. Decided, okay, we'll just walk on for a little bit. Walked on, still no Slava. And now we started thinking, perhaps we better go back and wait for the other 5. Went back, waited for the other 5, said, did you see Slava? No. We didn't see Slava either. We all set off on the same trail together. Kept going for a couple hours, still no Slava. All right, now we don't know where to go because the trail goes in different directions. We are lost. Fortunately, we all have backpacks, and we're smart hikers. You always carry heavier clothes with you.
Uh-huh.
You always carry a few munchies. You've got to have some munchies just in case. We all had water. So now we're thinking, what do we do? If we have to hunker down here all night in Siberia, literally lost in Siberia, what do we do? Because the Jets were going a whole different direction and coming down to camp a different way. All right, so we're sitting there. Finally, after about an hour, some Russians hiked by. Well, they didn't know where our camp is. They were going up on over another mountain for another 3 hours. We'd already been hiking for 4 or 5 hours. So we thought, well, we better just go with them because otherwise what's going to happen? What had happened is we would end on, I knew we were going in the proper direction, and when they mentioned they were going up and over a mountain, those were the mountains that I thought Rob had mentioned we were going to do the next day. So we set off with them, and as we hiked along for another hour and a half or something like that, all of a sudden down there in the valley, there was our camp. So we set down to our camp, waited there. Rob and the Jets appeared about an hour, 2 hours later. We waited till Rob at least took off his dirty, stinky clothes before we all jumped on him and said, "What nonsense is going on here? You know, we were lost in Siberia." And he went to find out in Russian from both Leonid and Slava what happened. Well, it turned out that Slava's horse was getting tired. So instead of waiting for us at the top of the mountain, he thought his horse was more important to get to camp and give it some water and take care of it than to wait for us up there. It was just ludicrous, Scary but funny.
Now, you say there's two, but before you get to your second story, I should have asked, you said that there are some trips you've been on that you've hated. Was this one of them?
No, I didn't hate it because there were just so many funny incidents, and it made such great stories.
Okay.
It was worthwhile for the scenery and for the camaraderie. But if I tell you the tour organizer dropped this trip right after our experience, and it's never been repeated.
So it just didn't meet up with their standards of what organized was, or
Absolutely not. It was called an exploratory, but even with an exploratory, you really do expect plates for 14 people, tents. You know, yes, there are some things that are not going to go right. You can deal with that, but losing tourists out there on a mountain somewhere, no, I don't think that's acceptable at all.
Well, they didn't lose all the tourists, but
No, he didn't. But then the second to the last day, Leonid always was in front of the Jets. And Leonid, I mean, he could cook. He could set a new world's record in marathons, probably. I mean, Leonid would set off with the Jets behind him, and that was it. Well, he set out crashing and bushwhacking through bushes instead of taking this very distinct trail down. And Rob stayed at the very back of the pack because he was going to be shepherd.
okay.
We're bushwhacking, and husband and myself are moving as fast as for me, my short little legs can carry me, trying to keep up with the Jets, trying not to lose sight of Leonid. I'm 5'3", and these bushes came up to my shoulders, you know, and I could barely see over them. I'm thinking, great, now I'm going to get lost in the bushes. Nobody will ever find me. And finally, everybody catches up. We're all huffing and puffing. We sit down, and Leonid goes, "Where's Rob?" We have no idea. The long and the short of the whole story is we lost Rob. We lost our tour leader, our American tour leader. Now, Leonid leaves us there with Slava. They take the horses, and they go searching for him all over the mountain. They can't find Rob. Well, if we think we were moving fast before, now Leonid and Slava hustle us in quadruple time, bushwhacking still along a river to a campsite so they can desert us there and go looking for Rob seriously. They didn't find him. Rob did not materialize until the next day along the trail. He spent, fortunately, as I said, he's a very savvy person, and he spent the night out, and Rob, of all people, didn't carry any extra clothing with him, so he just spent the night out there in the forest, under some bushes somewhere, and the next day headed out for where he thought our camp spot should be, but wasn't because, again, Leonid even diverted from that and camped us in a different area.
Oh, gee.
Yeah, it was just story after story.
Oh, my goodness.
Despite all this, Chris, there are some really good tour operators out there who do Siberia, and I still would not try to discourage anybody from doing it. But if somebody wants to do it on their own, they have got to speak fluent Russian. Otherwise, it's a lost cause.
Interesting. Well, that's one of the questions we usually get to. So it's just not accessible with just speaking English?
Not at all. Not at all. When we came across those Russians that day, nobody spoke English, but we happened to have our cook amongst the snails. This poor little cook was like 17 years old and must have carried 60 pounds of all the pots and whatever there was on her back, and she spoke English. So we would tell her the problem, and then she was crying to the Russians, "We're lost," you know, and they would relate back, and then she would translate back to us. They did not speak English.
Okay. Interesting. I just wanted to say, you were talking about the Jets, and we said that that one of them ran the Pikes Peak Marathon. I'm not sure that everybody knows what that is, but it'd be a marathon that goes up Pikes Peak. So that's roughly from 5,000 feet elevation to 14,000 feet elevation in a marathon. So people have some idea what you're talking about there.
Not only that, it's 13 miles.
Right.
13 miles uphill.
Yeah.
No wonder that woman could out-hike anybody.
Right. And of course that elevation. So, good grief.
Yes, it was something. It was a marvel to behold. Let me tell you that.
So the sites that you're seeing are mostly just wilderness, forest, lakes, trees.
Correct. That's correct. But
Okay.
there is a lot more to Siberia than just trekking, though most people do go out for the mountain experiences, fishing. There is Mount Beluga, which we did end up camping underneath the base of. That's one of the biggest mountains in the Altai, and there were tons of Korean and Japanese expeditions that were going up to the top of Mount Beluga and back down.
Interesting.
So we did run into them.
And is that a technical climb, or?
Yes, it is a technical climb.
Okay.
I don't think it's super, super technical. It's nothing like an Everest, but
Sure.
it is a mountaineering trip.
Okay.
Definitely a mountaineering trip. And then, of course, if you would keep going, which in hindsight, I think I would have liked to have done that and gone to Lake Baikal and then kept working my way east to the Kamchatka Peninsula. See the dormant volcanoes and the wildlife there. That would have been really, really interesting.
No, we've talked about the worst days you had. What was the best day you had on this trip?
Well, the best days were always, for me, when I trek, is when you get to the top of the mountain in one piece and you go, oh my God, this is so drop-dead beautiful. And then you get down the other side without getting killed, and you're done for the day. I'm sorry, that's about it. I mean, I enjoy the looking around and the air and everything else, but I really do worry about, well, am I going to slide down the scree, which is loose, gravelly, pebbly rock, which some people don't know what scree is, or, you know, what kind of boo-boos am I going to have? And then you take off your hiking boots, and it's like running or any kind of exercise you do. When you're done, it is the best feeling in the entire world.
And I almost hesitate to ask one warning you would give about somebody who's going to repeat this kind of trip.
Well, if you do want to hike or trek or whatever, it's obvious that you have to be in fairly decent shape to begin with. You don't just go out there. We've been on trips with people, as a matter of fact, in Kyrgyzstan, where there was this young lady whose dad thought, oh, this sounds like an interesting trip for you. Why don't you give it a try? She didn't exercise. She had never done anything, but fortunately, it was 100% horse-supported. So she ended up riding the whole trek, which is fine if you could do that. This was not an option on the Siberian Altai trek. There were exactly two horses. Slava had one, and one of his honchos had another. So that was it as far as the horses go. So you could not ride. The second thing is, no matter what they say about travel insurance, and you must have evacuation insurance for all this, it is worth nada. I mean, how in heaven's name are they going to evacuate you from a mountain out in the midst of Siberia where there is nothing around? There are no landlines. There are no cell towers. Nobody is going to get you out. If you run into a potentially life-threatening situation, you're going to die out there. So I think you should be aware of not only that in the Altai, but in lots of other areas, Pakistan or some of these very, very remote areas, which you never think of until you're there.
Okay.
All you can do is try to minimize it by being in the best shape that you are. I always carry every kind of antibiotic known to humankind, bandages, munchies, definitely take munchies because that was another thing. There was not enough food, and we ate every single thing in our stash and shared. We all shared whatever we had. So, you know, you never know what's not. You've got incipient starvation out there, too.
Gee. And what were they feeding you? What?
That doesn't sound like fun.
Was it good Siberian fare? I don't know what that is, actually.
Well, no, because of course our poor little cook had to carry primarily tinned goods because it has to last. So every day the bread got harder and harder and harder until thankfully it disappeared and we could forget about the hard as a rock bread. And it's just whatever garbage you can have that's in a can. Tuna, spam, potatoes kept. But it was not exactly what you call sumptuous gourmet dining.
Who's the most memorable person you met on this trip?
Memorable in which way? Anne, who hiked, who does the Pikes Peak Marathon, was unbelievably memorable because Anne was in her 60s also. You're not talking about a 35-year-old who does this. So Anne was truly, truly remarkable to be able to still do something like that at the ages that we're at.
How about of the Russians or Siberians?
Well, of course, good old Slava, who left us because his horse was more important. What was interesting about Slava is if people go on my website and go back to my archives about this particular trip, I do have a photo of Slava. And his face is very Alaskan. You could just see where the whole land bridge from Alaska, from the Americas, led into the continent of Asia. Just from his facial characteristics.
Huh. Interesting. Any other questions I should ask?
Any other questions you should ask? Well, I would definitely, as I said, not just Siberia, but Russia, of course, is just so tremendously gigantic. I would like to go to the Crimea. As I said, I would like to go see Lake Baikal. The friend that I was referring to who did take the Trans-Siberian Express did go to Baikal and did go in the winter and took one of those freezing dips in there. And then, of course, everybody runs naked to the sauna. I can't remember what they call the sauna in Russian, but the typical sauna, and gets warm all over again. And she said that was really fantastic in that area. There are so many areas around Siberia that we had been to. Kyrgyzstan, that trek there has to be one of the most incredibly drop-dead, gorgeous mountain areas I've ever seen in my whole life. When we came into one valley with mountains in all directions, I actually burst into tears. It was so beautiful. Just pristine, beautiful, wonderful people, et cetera, et cetera.
How would you contrast the Kyrgyzstan? I mean, you did the same company. You did Kyrgyzstan. How were they different? That one worked.
Kyrgyzstan had fabulous tour organizers. Rob was the same leader, whole different set of people. We felt very safe there, even though when we were in Kyrgyzstan, that was the incident when some Japanese were kidnapped in the mountains there. But the shepherds came down from the mountains and they told our group, we were camped in this one valley, about it. And Rob and the Russian tour organizers immediately set off getting us back to America safely, which entailed traveling through 3 countries by bus because they didn't want to risk us flying, sitting in the local Russian agencies while they tried to decide how they were going to get us from country to country, because truthfully the Russians didn't care if we were kidnapped, or these countries didn't care if we were kidnapped. They just didn't want us kidnapped in their particular country. Very bad press. It's like, well, we don't want them captured in Kyrgyzstan. Have them go through Turkmenistan, or have them go through Kazakhstan, or one of the other umpteen stands that were around there, or to end up in Uzbekistan. So we had great organizers there. Mountain Travel Sobek did a fabulous job. Unfortunately, they dropped it from their brochure, not because it wasn't a good trip or people weren't going, but because they were having some problems in Kyrgyzstan.
Sure. Interesting. If you had to summarize this trip with 3 words, what 3 words would you use? And try and keep it clean, please.
3 words. That is so tough, Chris. It would be gorgeous,
Okay.
which it was, uncomfortable, and experience is the kindest word that I could say, but actually experience does sum it up. It was a learning experience. I always expect my trips to run smoothly and take it as a personal affront from God when it doesn't. And we learned a lot. I learned perhaps a little more to ask, and I would still take an exploratory trip, but perhaps I would ask a few more questions.
What questions would you ask? That's a great...
Well, have you ever used this tour organizer, your local tour organizer, before? What kind of track record do they have?
Mm-hmm.
Do you recommend that we carry more food with us, just in case it turns out to be inedible? Perhaps a few things like that.
Well, Sheila, I thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us a little about your adventure, I think we'd have to call it, in Siberia. And if people wanted to hear more about it, where would they go?
Well, if they want to go onto my site and comment, I answer all my comments, and then once I do that, we're in email touch. I hesitate to put my personal email out there for the world, but they will get to me. Any comments or any questions that they have, I'm more than happy to answer.
And you need to tell us where your site is.
My site is Travels with Sheila, TravelsWithSheila.com.
And I'll put a link to that in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Sheila, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Chris, it's been a pleasure. I always love talking about traveling. It's a pleasure to contact and talk with other people who are equally interested.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, I'm curious to hear what people think of this show. I'm afraid the sound quality just barely met my standards in terms of putting it on. I have a no cell phone rule because of sound quality, and Sheila had a cordless phone, which kind of flirted with that, and I had to play a little bit with that, so I hope that was listenable. And also, I wasn't sure whether or not to do this show because we haven't really done that many shows that have been kind of a more negative experience, at least since the Bad Hotels episode, which I think was episode 2 or 3 way back in the beginning of this show. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this particular show. I hope you enjoyed it. I left it in because I thought Sheila was a good storyteller, and that's quite a story. Sheila talked in her interview about getting lost. Sometimes it's good to be lost intentionally. The internet resource I have for you today is a site called LostHotels.com. Dare to get lost. The most amazing lost hotels in the world meet the following criteria: being independently owned, have less than 100 rooms, show a permanent commitment to excellent service, have a unique personality reflecting the local culture, are not connected to a global distribution system, and have the ability to change your life, is what they say about this site. Check out for some interesting hotels with character, talking about getting lost intentionally. LostHotels.com. In news from the community, I did get a letter a little while ago from Aaron. Aaron is working his way through old episodes of the podcast. He's fairly new to the world of podcasting and just recently discovered The Amateur Traveler. One interesting thing that reminds me of is that The Amateur Traveler does have a lot of people who are downloading not just the new show, but the most recent show. Last month, I think for the first time, or at least the first time I've noticed, we had about 100,000 downloads of both the newer and older shows within the month. So that's a fairly significant milestone for me. Anyway, Aaron also pointed out that in the episode we did on Divine Biking Tours, Divine Adventures, that we mentioned a site called W Cities that had wonderful city guides for the iPod, did point out that that is not Mac compatible. I think he wondered why someone like me, who's owned a Mac for 20 years, could recommend something like that. But obviously a lot of you have Windows machines, but I do apologize for not mentioning that way back in that show. And with that, we'll bring this episode of The Amateur Traveler to a close. If you have any comments, feel free to drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com or share it with the rest of the community by commenting on the show at amateurtraveler.com or going to the discussion boards, amateurtraveler.com/board. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe.